The Cannabis Heals Me podcast, episode 105.
You're listening to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast, where we explore the real stories of real people who have discovered the profound healing properties of the cannabis plant in their own lives. Find more at cannabishealsme.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. This is your host, Rachel Kennerly, and we're coming to you once again from the Storybook Inn Studios. We are back with our second episode of the week. I really hope you guys enjoyed Monday's show, and we're actually going to tee off of our subject on Monday regarding vaccines with an episode today. And before you get completely terrified and turn the show off immediately, let me go ahead and remind you to click the subscribe button so that you will always get the latest episode of the Cannabis Heals Me podcast downloaded to your device, to your computer, to your phone, to whatever it is you're using to access this podcast. While you're out there subscribing, we would certainly appreciate a rating and a review. And the reason I always ask you to do this, and those of you who are regular listeners to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast already know why I ask you to do this every week, and you're probably repeating it back to me right now. But if you're new to the show, if you're new to podcasts in general, the reason I'm asking you to give us a rating or review is because that boosts the algorithms of whatever podcast app you're using, and the podcast app will actually recommend our show to other people who are listening to similar type programs. So rating and reviewing the show is a free way for you to get information out about the podcast. And if you leave us a review, I will be happy to read that review on the air. Another thing I would love for you to do is go out and subscribe to our email newsletter list. If you go out to cannabishealsme.com/subscribe, you will be able to put in your email address, hit the enter button, and you'll get signed up for our email newsletter. Now, don't worry, I am not going to send you 50 spam emails every day. You will get maybe 1 or 2 or 3 a week at the most. Sometimes I send 0 because I am short on hours and long on my to-do list. But when we do send those out, it's a little short. Hey, this is the episode that's up. Occasionally we'll email you about maybe some important legislation that maybe you should know about so that you can take action on it. And the reason we do it through the email list is because the social media apps have a tendency to suppress cannabis-related content. If it's something important that we want to get directly to you without having to worry about Facebook or Instagram or Twitter suppressing that information, the email newsletter list is the best way to do that. So go out to cannabishealsme.com/subscribe. Now, I mentioned previously that today's episode is going to kind of tee off our episode on Monday. And our guest for Monday, Sarah, had an injury from a vaccine, which caused her dysautonomia, which has caused her a lifetime of medical problems. And one of the major themes of this show is bodily autonomy and being able to choose what we put on our body. In regards to the subject of vaccines, there's a push, which to me, as a liberty-minded person, is a little disturbing to see that there's a push by government to mandate or force people to inject things either into themselves or into the bodies of their own children, with no regard for the fact that sometimes vaccines do cause injury, like to our guest Sarah. Her doctor told her, you should never ever get another vaccine. And he also recommended that she not vaccinate her child because of her past history with vaccines. But in some states like New York and California and New Jersey, your ability to opt out of vaccines is actually being removed. You don't have that option anymore if you want your child to attend any sort of school or daycare or anything like that. So I invited Bretigne Shaffer on to talk to us about this subject. Bretigne is a longtime libertarian journalist, and she lives in California, which is where some of these mandates are being enforced on the population. So it's really hitting close to home. Actually, it's hitting exactly at home for her. So I invited her on to talk to us about this subject from a liberty-based perspective and just try to strip away the emotion that tends to rise up whenever you talk about vaccines or questioning vaccines and their efficacy and their safety, and just strip it down to the bare bones like we do with cannabis, looking at the issue of vaccines from the perspective of medical freedom and bodily autonomy. So we're hoping to strip out the emotion and talk about this from a purely natural rights, bodily autonomy perspective. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. I'm sure this is kind of a contentious issue, and so I do kind of expect to get feedback. And if you want to send me an email, podcast@cannabishillsme.com, I'd love to hear from you. I am joined today by Bretigne Shaffer, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't want to mispronounce your last name.
Great.
And it's Bretigne, not Brittany.
It is. That's right, Bretigne.
Bretigne, I wanted to have you on because on Monday's episode, I spoke to a lady who had a vaccine injury as a child. And so I wanted to kind of tee off of her story and how she uses cannabis to cope with this dysautonomia from vaccine injury, and just talk about the issue of vaccines and not necessarily approach it from a science basis, because I'm still a little fuzzy on the science part of it. And if you go out there and you look at statistics, you can look at this statistic to prove what you want to think. So I wanted to approach it more from a libertarian perspective, where we talk about maybe bodily autonomy and medical freedom or informed consent, because I think that's at the heart of what's going on in the vaccine industry. And I had heard you on a podcast with Bob Murphy talking about some stuff that's going on in California and New York and New Jersey about some vaccine mandates. And so my friend reached out to you and said, hey, would you like to come on and talk about this? And here we are.
Yeah, awesome. No, that sounds great. That is sort of what's at the heart of it. And I can talk about the science if it comes up, but I think really the core issue here is bodily autonomy. So where those two sort of cross over is a lot of people are taken in by the herd immunity argument, which plenty of people have knocked down and have sort of explained why that doesn't make any sense. But what I'll say without going into sort of the faulty science of that is just, you don't have a right to other people's biome. You don't have a right to dictate what germs are in another person. And to me, it all comes down to a question of private property. First of all, do you own yourself? Are you in charge of making decisions over your own body, over your children's bodies? And then where the only place it becomes a challenge is then, will you go out into the world and you're interacting with other people? And this is such a great example to me of how private property kind of gets rid of the whole problem. Because if there were absolutely no commons, if there were no public spaces that weren't owned by some entity making decisions, then every single business, every single school, every home, every entity would be deciding for themselves, am I comfortable with the risk of having someone with full-blown Ebola coming into my hospital or into my place of work? And that's a decision that the property owner rightfully should be making. And they're also the ones, not even from a rights standpoint, but just from a practical standpoint, they're the ones who are going to be most aware of what the risk is and also accountable for any, if there is harm done, they're the ones who bear the costs of that. So to me, that would just get rid of the problem. And what's interesting is the demand for mandates are all coming from legislatures. And they're not really coming from the legislatures. They're coming from the pharmaceutical industry, which is paying legislators to propose this legislation and then go out and get support for it and get all the other legislators behind it.
Hey guys, wanted to tell you real quick about our podcast host and sponsor, Anchor.fm. If you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I highly recommend Anchor. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They'll distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go out to Anchor.fm to get started. That's Anchor.fm. Now back to the show. And I think to tie that back into cannabis is that we see that in the cannabis world as well.
Oh, yeah.
Where in the states where we're trying to get, I'm in Texas and we don't have access to legal cannabis. And so in the states where, I mean, you're fighting an uphill battle because you're fighting against politicians that get large campaign contributions from the pharmaceutical industry.
Yep, and they don't like competition.
Exactly. So these same companies that we despise when it comes to influencing legislation regarding whether or not we can choose to use cannabis as medicine or for whatever other purposes we want to use that particular substance for, but we give them a free pass when it comes to vaccine legislation, and everybody jumps on the bandwagon with the legislators and say, oh yeah, you totally need to force those people to inject stuff into their body and into the bodies of their children.
Yeah, and I think that's because of a really successful and well-funded PR campaign that's been going on for decades. The first I remember, well, I mean, it's been going on longer than I've been watching it, but the first I remember was the Law and Order episode where the parents were sued because their unvaccinated child gave another child measles. I mean, how they determined that, I don't even know. And so they were sued for recklessness or negligence or something, because it was the first time I saw someone being held accountable for not being vaccinated, as if being not vaccinated was a crime. And so there's been this massive, and it's huge. I mean, once you start looking at the news coverage in the mainstream press of vaccines, it's mind-boggling. I mean, it will completely blow your mind that it's most of it is, can't even say most of it, all of it is pure propaganda. It's just PR talking points. It's repeating the same thing over and over again. Vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccines don't cause autism. And then the narrative, you're irresponsible if you don't vaccinate. You owe it to the people around you. So there's been this huge narrative being pushed for years. And I think, as with most things, probably as with cannabis too, if you don't take the time to look at it yourself, chances are most people are just going to buy into it. Most people will just accept it because that's what they're hearing. I just did a piece that's somewhat related. I just wrote an article on LouRockwell.com about an NBC piece where the whole premise of the article is this was about a woman whose child had died from the flu after she had presumably not given him Tamiflu. The whole thing was premised on the idea that, Tamiflu is the right thing to do for your child if he has the flu. Well, it turns out that's not true. There's actually no evidence for that. And in the same article, they're, demeaning these natural remedies that other parents were recommending. Well, the fact is those natural remedies, the specific ones that the reporter mentioned, actually have scientific evidence for their efficacy. So what's going on in the mainstream press has nothing to do with the facts or the truth of the matter. It's all PR. It's just on this issue. It's pure PR. But again, if you're not looking closely yourself, digging into their statements, I think most people are just going to accept that. And it's been a very effective PR campaign.
Well, and I think we've seen that with cannabis because for 80 years, our government has told us this plant has no medicinal properties whatsoever.
Right.
And anybody
and
who uses
madness.
Exactly. Anybody who uses this plant needs to be thrown in a cage. And they were very effective in getting out that message. But to me, I think it's backfiring because, I was a child of the 1980s Just Say No and the DARE program. And, this is a horrible thing. You're going to go crazy and kill your mother with an axe.
Right.
And now I'm thinking to myself, and I think a lot of people kind of find themselves in the same position. It's like, okay, if the government has lied to me for 80 years about a plant, what else are they lying to me about? And so it's caused me to have a lot of skepticism about anything coming out of their mouths. And I wouldn't necessarily categorize myself as a conspiracy theorist, but it's like if they're going to lie about a plant, what else are they willing to lie about? And so and even some other people, I spoke to a lady the other day in Scotland, and we kind of brought this up. And she even mentioned vaccines specifically. She said, well, if they lied about this, are they lying about vaccines? And so it's caused me Now, I will go ahead and give the caveat that my son, as of, I don't know, 7 or 8, was fully vaccinated. And I don't know what vaccines he's supposed to have now that he's 10. And
Good.
Right. And he never had any adverse reactions, but I mean, he's rarely sick. I mean, in the time that he's been with us, he's only been sick, like, I can count on one hand the number of days he's actually been ill and not gone to do normal functions. I am on a quest now to learn more before I inject this next vaccine into my child.
Yeah,
I want to learn more about it. And, I've never, had a flu vaccine myself because I don't like needles. And I've known so many people that have gotten a flu vaccine and then they still get the flu because they chose the wrong strain this year to vaccinate against.
It's notoriously ineffective. And there are also studies showing that if you get the flu vaccine one year, you're more likely to be hospitalized for respiratory problems in following years. So I don't see any reason ever to get it. Again, everyone has to look at the evidence themselves, but what's being pushed in the media and by pharmacies and doctors' offices and all this is nothing more than propaganda.
Yeah, and just my own personal experience with the flu is kind of like, well, no, I'm not going to do that because, like I said, I've just seen too many people that got the flu shot. My sister-in-law is one of them. She's a school nurse, and I think she was required to get the flu shot by her job, and she still wound up with flu A. And then my other sister-in-law, who's also a school nurse, she ended up, I don't know if she got the flu shot. I know she has, anyway, I'm not going to go into it because she probably don't want me telling her medical business. So I think she got the flu as well. And then I had said, oh, you better take some Tamiflu because I've always heard these wonderful things about Tamiflu, how it shortens the length of the flu. And she's like, no, I'm not taking that stuff because it doesn't work. And I mean, I was like taken aback, like, what?
Yeah, it doesn't work, and it's got some kind of scary side effects too.
And that's what she had mentioned because she has some medical issues that this Tamiflu could cause complications with that. Yeah. And so I was taken aback by the fact, because I'd always heard Tamiflu is a miracle drug and that, the minute you get the flu, you should take it and you won't get the full-blown flu.
And the people who make Tamiflu are now being sued by whistleblowers because they falsified that information. They actually had articles, like PR pieces, written up to show that there was efficacy where there wasn't. And by virtue of that, they got governments to pay, I think, billions of dollars to stock up on Tamiflu. And now these whistleblowers are coming out saying, well, actually, that information was false and the efficacy wasn't there. And you guys, you bilked these governments out of all this money. And so they're being sued now.
That's interesting. And that leads me to a couple of questions and if you can't answer it, it's okay.
Sure.
My first question is, who makes Tamiflu? And then the second question is, do those same people that make Tamiflu also make flu vaccines?
So Hoffmann La Roche makes Tamiflu, and you know what? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there's a connection.
Because that would be a pretty sweet deal. It's like, okay, you got to take this flu shot, and you think now you're bulletproof against the flu, and then no, you get the flu anyway, and so now we're going to say Tamiflu.
Right.
After the flu shot failed.
I don't actually know if Hoffmann La Roche makes a flu vaccine. I should know that. Pretty sure GSK is. I can look it up here. But yeah, that's a good question.
Because that would be one heck of a money-making scheme.
Yeah.
Let's sell them a flu shot that didn't work, and then sell them a medication that doesn't work on top of that.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that one of the arguments that Dell and others make is that about vaccines is that we've seen. So in 1986, that's when vaccine manufacturers were granted liability.
Yeah, tell us more about that, because I was not aware that vaccine manufacturers had zero liability, correct?
Pretty much zero. So I think there is a clause whereby if you can prove intent or something, something at a really high level of culpability that you can then take them to court, to
Okay.
an actual court.
But you have to actually prove that they were doing this
has
maliciously, which is a very
something
high
like that.
bar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Tell us more about that 1986 legislation, because a lot of people may not be familiar with it. And I know I wasn't until a few years ago when I started asking these additional questions. So see if you can kind of tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, and I'm no expert on this at all, but just basically what had happened was the DPT vaccine had caused a lot of problems and was eventually taken off the market and replaced with the DTaP, actually the DTaP and then the Tdap, but basically replacing a live vaccine with an attenuated vaccine. I think because of that, there's probably more to the story than that. But pharmaceutical companies basically went to the government and said, we can't, we're at such risk of liability that we're worried we're not going to be able to produce vaccines anymore. Please help us. And so in 1986, legislation was signed into action called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And basically what that meant was it created a fund, and that fund is funded by, it's not a tax, it's like I guess you could call it a tax. It's an additional charge on each vaccine that parents pay. And that goes into this fund that then pays out for damages. So if let's say you believe your child was injured by a vaccine, you then have to go to what's called vaccine court and make your case. And it's very, very, it's hostile, it's difficult, and it's not just people who are critical of vaccines who are saying that. So let me see if I can find this. In 2015, a scholar from Stanford actually studied this. They actually wrote a paper about the vaccine injury compensation program. So basically what this Stanford scholar found was, and I'll quote from this article about it too, the bottom line is that the vaccine injury compensation program was supposed to offer simple justice to vaccine-injured children, but it has largely failed to do so, wrote Stanford law professor Nora Freeman Engstrom in her research article. So basically, what she describes is what advocates of medical freedom have been talking about for years. It's a hostile program. They make it very difficult for anybody to get through to the point to where they can actually make a claim. She says, the results are discouraging, despite initial optimism in Congress and beyond that such a fund could resolve claims efficiently and amicably. In operation, the program has been astonishingly slow and surprisingly combative. And she goes on, you can look at the article and then look at her report as well. I don't think anybody looking at this system would say, oh yes, this is a legitimate way. This is an effective way of making the vaccine manufacturers accountable or of in any way protecting people from whatever damage they might suffer from vaccines. The other issue, and people throw different numbers around, I'm not going to commit to an actual number, but I'll just say what I know about what's known about this. The other issue is that the VAERS, so it starts with a VAERS report, a vaccine adverse effect reporting system. And it's notoriously underreported. So most doctors, when they're confronted with something that might be a vaccine injury, even if the parent says, hey, I think this is a vaccine injury, most doctors blow it off. Most doctors, insist that it's not, and very, very few will report it. So
now VAERS, just for clarification, that's the portal where these vaccine injuries are supposed to be reported?
Yes, they're supposed to be reported.
And is that something that parents self-report, or do they have to rely on their practitioner to do that?
So you can self-report. In fact, that's one of the criticisms. The pro-vaxxers are always saying, well, anybody can just report anything they want to VAERS, so it's full of all this extra nonsense. Well, the reality is that's not true. When you look at who is reporting, most of the reports are coming from doctors and medical professionals. Some are coming from the pharmaceutical companies. The last time I checked, 7% were coming from either parents or caregivers. So a very small number of what's getting reported is actually coming from parents. You can do it. Most people don't know about it, and most doctors who should know about it aren't using it. So there have been a bunch of different numbers thrown around. Some people talk about 1% of adverse events are reported. That's more a number for drugs as a whole, and there is a study indicating that. There are other studies showing.
Is that the one that Harvard did, the 1% report?
So it's actually not that report. That report references that number. It repeats it, but it didn't find that number.
Okay.
I think what that's referring to is another study, and I don't have that up right now, but I can send you the link for that as well.
Okay.
Because it's an older study that looked at drug interactions as a whole. So it wasn't just for vaccines, but studies that have looked at reporting for vaccines have found anywhere between 15%. I think the highest I saw was like 40%. So no one disputes that these numbers are very much underreported. Mm-hmm. And in addition to those studies, there are also surveys that have been done of doctors' practices and finding out how many suspected vaccine injuries get reported. And it's small numbers. So it is underreported. I don't think anyone has an accurate number as to how much it's underreported.
Now, as far as vaccine court goes, is there a cap on how much a parent or person can get for a vaccine injury?
There is, and I should know that off the top of my head, and I don't. No, you know what? I don't know. I don't know what the cap is. I don't want to say a number. I'm just thinking. But yes, there is a cap. There is a cap.
It seems like I heard 250,000, but I don't know if that's an accurate number at all because I haven't researched it myself.
Yeah, and I would need to look into that because I've heard of cases where parents were awarded more than that. So mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that happened, and I'm probably not the right person to talk to. I would need to dig in and find out exactly what's so about. Yes, there is a cap, but I'm not sure it's a hard and fast cap. And I don't want to comment on the number because I'm not 100% sure of exactly what's going on there.
Do you, and you may not know this either, and if you don't, that's fine. Do you know what the total that's been paid out since this fund was created?
Yeah, so it's over $4 billion. I don't think I have a current number in front of me. Let me just see if I'm just looking to see if there's an up-to-date precise number, but it's over $4 billion. And again, keep in mind, this is $4 billion being paid out within a system that really tries to screen out as many people as it can. It's not addressing every injury. It's not acknowledging every injury. Even that $4 billion is not really, it's no indication at all of, the degree of vaccine injury.
And is there a time limit on how long people have to go and report these vaccine injuries?
I believe it's still 3 years. Unless that's changed. Again, I'm not an expert on this law. Last I checked, it was 3 years, and I haven't heard otherwise.
Okay. I wanted to go back and just kind of bring to people's attention how this fund is funded. And it doesn't sound like the pharmaceutical company pays anything into this fund, that it's all funded by people who are paying additional tax on what their vaccines cost. Is that correct?
I believe so. Again, I'm not an expert on this law. It may be that the pharmaceutical industry is paying some small portion of it. My understanding is that it's paid by a dollar amount on each vaccine that is given. And so it's the parent or the insurance company that's paying that. There may be more to it than that. So again, I don't want to say, yes, that's absolutely correct. There's nothing else going on, but that's what I believe.
As a liberty-minded person, if you remove financial accountability from the equation on these big corporations, which we're told constantly are evil and only concerned about their bottom line, if you remove any financial impetus for them to make vaccines as safe as humanly possible, it seems like you're just creating a monster.
It's kind of the definition of moral hazard. It's completely a monster. It's bizarre to me, I guess, because more people don't realize that this law even exists. But what's bizarre is that more liberty-minded people aren't really, that this isn't raising a huge red flag for them, because it's creating this protected zone where there's nothing to stop them from, and add to that, their links with the CDC and the WHO and the FDA. They've bought the regulatory agencies. It's hard to imagine a less libertarian setup, or a less friendly to freedom setup than what's going on with the pharmaceutical industry. But it really absolves them of any incentive to be worried about the effects of their products.
Yeah, and then you couple that with what we're seeing is increasing legislation coming out of states. I don't think there's any national push yet for mandatory vaccines, or is there?
There have been noises. I think there was one bill, I don't remember who put it forward, but there is one bill out there. There are definitely noises about making it national, but it doesn't seem to be as serious a threat as the state by state legislation.
Well, and that to me is terrifying, to think that the government can tell me what I have to inject into my child. I've got a friend who lives in New York.
Yeah.
And her daughter was supposed to start school this fall.
Right.
And right before school started, New York passed this new mandate that kids had to be vaccinated. Now, I will tell you, this is a family that I've known since I was a teenager. And they were one of the only families I knew. Their dad is a medical doctor. And they're like the only people I knew that even back in the 80s, early 80s, they were not vaccinated.
Wow.
And their dad was a medical doctor. So they've got a family tradition of not vaccinating.
Yeah.
And then they moved to New York State because of her husband's job, and her daughter was supposed to start attending school. And then they changed this. Wow. Now, are you familiar with the New York law? Is it everyone, or do they allow some medical exemptions for kids who have had vaccine injuries in the past?
Here's how the medical exemptions thing works. This is another part of the deception that the industry is trying to perpetrate, because and have done very well, have carried off this deception very well. So I'll first talk about California, because I'm more familiar with that, and it's
okay.
pretty much the same thing in New York. I think there may be some differences, but essentially what happened in California was, so there were two bills in California. The one in 2015, SB 277, removed the personal belief exemption. And the whole argument then on the part of the politicians who were pushing this was, well, you can still get a medical exemption. Don't worry, you can always get a medical exemption. And in fact, my understanding is that before that bill passed, medical exemptions had to be limited to basically the standards set by the CDC and ACIP, the advisory body on immunizations. And when SB 277 passed, Senator Pan, who wrote the bill, who was behind the bill, and was its biggest proponent, and it also receives tons of money from the pharmaceutical industry, he said very explicitly, there will be no limits on what this is between you and your doctor, there will be no limits on what a doctor can say is a legitimate exemption. Almost as soon as that bill passed, and this is a great example of how the political system is in sort of lockstep, if not direct control of the media, almost immediately you started seeing stories in the California press about how parents were using this loophole of medical exemptions, and how we had to go after these medical exemptions because parents were using it as an excuse not to vaccinate their kids. So just last year, they passed SB 276, which it makes the medical exemption, it restricts it so much as to make it basically impossible to get.
So even for kids who have a history of being injured by these vaccines.
Yeah, for quite a lot of them, essentially. And I did a post on this a while ago, showing on one side. And so what's interesting about this is that the CDC, so they're going by the CDC recommendations, which is very, very narrow. So it's like, yes, if you've suffered severe anaphylactic reaction to a vaccine, to a particular vaccine, then you can get an exemption for that vaccine. You still have to get all the other vaccines. And if you suffered, say, seizures or something from another vaccine, too bad, you still have to get it. So it makes the criteria so narrow, and not only narrow, but in defiance of what the FDA itself says about these vaccines. So you can look at the manufacturers' reports on adverse events for this vaccine, look at the FDA site where it lists adverse events for these vaccines, and in some cases it says this vaccine is contraindicated if you have a history of such and such reaction to a similar vaccine, or if you have seizures, or whatever it is. There are acknowledged adverse events to certain vaccines that do not qualify for a person for an exemption under the California law, because the California law says, no, it has to meet the CDC and ACIP requirements for what constitutes a contraindication. And it's so narrow. The other thing, though, other than the law that makes it so narrow as to be almost meaningless, is that even before that law passed, the state of California or I should say the city of San Francisco and the state licensing boards started persecuting doctors who were giving medical exemptions. So these are doctors who were perfectly within the law, granting medical exemptions, and the state started going after them. So they've created such a hostile environment. Part of SB 276, by the way, also is that any doctor who gives more than 5 exemptions will automatically be investigated.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
So much for it being between you and your doctor.
Exactly. No, that was a complete lie. And, as with everything else in politics, politicians who make bald-faced lies like that suffer no consequences for it. So that was sort of the progression of what happened in California. It's similar in New York.
Now, let me go back for just a sec. Now, that law, is that for everyone, or is that just for anyone who wants their child to attend public school?
It's for anyone who wants their child to attend any school. Or
okay, so
daycare.
they don't even get a carve out for private school.
No.
Wow.
No, in fact, they're in New Jersey, as their legislation was being amended, they initially said, well, we're gonna carve out an exception for private schools. Private schools, don't have to do this, or it's not going to be as onerous. And there was such an outcry because that was discriminatory, and then that didn't pass. But that's the first time I've heard of there being a distinction between public and private. Everywhere else in the country, this is law. It's the I guess it's the Department of Education. It applies to all schools, public, private, daycare.
Wow.
Yeah. So you can't get away from it. And so just in the same way that we saw the press starting to go after medical exemptions as soon as the previous law had passed, we're now starting to see the press go after homeschoolers.
Well, that's terrifying. I homeschool, and one of the reasons I homeschool is because, well, I think my son is getting a better quality education, but I also want less government involvement in my life. So what is their plan to enforce this on homeschoolers?
I don't know. My guess is that they're going to, in the next year or so, at least in California, and, California sort of leads the way in tyranny in this country, so expect to see it elsewhere. But, they're talking about now, so whereas before it was parents using the medical exemption as a loophole to get around the vaccine requirement, now they're using homeschooling as a loophole. So what they're describing the law itself as a loophole. What was promised to them, the medical exemptions, what was promised to them explicitly is now a loophole. So so I fully expect, we're looking at property elsewhere. I fully expect to see them try to go after homeschoolers in California and elsewhere too, and adults as well. So you can cut this out if you want. This gets into the science just a little bit, but
no, that's fine. I don't mind doing a little science. I just don't want it to be a totally science-based approach. I just want to kind of approach it from the perspective of medical freedom and bodily autonomy.
Right. And I think the rights argument is more, sadly, it doesn't appeal to as many people, but I think it's more critical. That's what's under assault. What's really under assault are our most basic fundamental rights. But what I will say about the herd immunity argument is, the argument is that, well, we've got to have 95% of the population vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity. What's crazy about that is that they're only talking about children. So we don't have 95% of the population vaccinated. Probably some of the estimates I've seen, because, so let's just talk about measles, because that's what they want everybody to freak out about.
Right.
Even though it's a very mild illness in developed countries. The measles vaccine wanes over time. Most people as adults will not have any, first of all, let's assume it was protective in the first place. It's not protective for everybody. The primary vaccine failure is when it just doesn't work on you. Secondary vaccine failure is when maybe it worked for a while, but 10, 12, 15 years down the line, you're not getting any protection from that anymore. So how many adults do you know who have been, vaccinated for the measles in the last 5, 10, 15 years?
Not very many.
Yeah. So more than likely, the number is at least 50%, probably more like 60 or 75% of adults who are quote unquote unvaccinated. Now, add to that all the vaccines that have been added to the schedule, starting mostly around 1986, conveniently, all the other vaccines that you and I didn't get as kids. So, I was vaccinated. I had maybe, I don't know, I'd have to go look at my records, maybe 6 or 8, maybe 10 vaccines. The numbers now, it's more like, depending on, exactly which ones you get, it's like 60 to 70 vaccines that a kid gets before they're 16.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that surprised me, because I was a foster mom for a while, and I had some little babies that we fostered, and they were not current on vaccines. And so, and they were like tiny. They were preemie babies, and they were 2 or 3 months old. So they weighed maybe 6 pounds, a piece. Well, they caught them all up on all their vaccines same day. And those little girls were just like little pin cushions.
Oh my God.
And they ran fever, but there weren't any of the adverse side effects that you sometimes hear about. But I had no clue that they were going to give that many shots to those little girls.
They just, it's.
And the things that they
crazy.
vaccinate for now, like, don't they vaccinate for chicken pox now?
Yeah. So there's a chickenpox vaccine, which I could go into a whole story about that. But yeah, and so the other part of it, which I won't go into detail about this, but things like chickenpox and measles, there's a good argument to be made that in some ways those vaccines have actually made things worse. Because, for example, with the measles vaccine, they've made the case fatality rate worse. Because whereas before, infants would be protected because their mothers had it as children, and so they were able to pass on the antibodies through breast milk. Now, if you've got a whole generation of mothers who mostly didn't have it, then they're not passing on that immunity to infants. Infants and the elderly are kind of the most at-risk groups, for measles. They're the ones for whom it's the most deadly. And there are numbers to back this up. The incidence of measles deaths in infants and the elderly has gone up since the vaccine. So the burden of the disease has been shifted from the sort of the healthiest part of the population to get it, which is young children, to infants who aren't getting it now from breast milk, and the elderly because their vaccines worn off, and now they don't get lifelong immunity anymore. So there are, and again, I won't go into great detail with all of that, but there are arguments to be made for how the vaccine has actually harmed us in terms of exposure to those diseases.
Because just having the vaccine doesn't put the antibodies in your body for life, correct? I don't know. I don't have no medical, but
yes,
you said that they don't pass the antibodies along to the babies in breast milk
because they're no longer. So it gets the body to produce antibodies for a while, but it doesn't have the ability to produce those antibodies for life. Basically, okay. So, someone might get lucky enough and it works on them until they're 70. But generally with measles, and I don't have the number in front of me for this either, but it's something like 10 to 15 years, I think, that on average that whatever benefits it confers last.
If vaccines aren't effective long term, then why I guess there's the option of running a titer to see if you still have the antibodies in your body. Why isn't there more of a push for adults get a second or third round of vaccines, like in their middle ages or whatever.
That's starting. There is sort of more of a push that you'll see like the WHO talking about it more, and there are, more adult vaccines coming on the market. I don't remember when the latest adult MMR. One thing they found though is that with the adult MMR, repeated boosters don't really have the effects that they don't really boost you that much. So it's hard for them to defend that on scientific grounds. But I fully expect, I don't know if you saw, there was an article just this last week, I think, written by a consortium of educational institutions and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and among others, saying in the context of Corona, airplanes are such a petri dish of infection, we shouldn't allow the unvaccinated to fly. Mm-hmm. And I fully expect, in fact, was it Argentina? I think Argentina recently passed a law that you can't get a driver's license unless you can show your vaccination records. The EU is talking about that for passports. So it's already happening. I mean, there is a push to start mandating vaccination for adults. And it's not clear what that would mean because, again, the adults living today got nothing like the schedule that kids now are getting. Mm-hmm. And I think when adults, even the ones who aren't paying attention, if they're faced with the reality of, okay, here are your 72 shots, come and get them, I think there's going to be a lot of questioning at that point. But it is coming. They are pushing for it. And I would expect to see more of that in the near future.
I find it pretty terrifying that they're going to tie vaccinations to your ability to get a driver's license, which you have to have in order to drive, or to get a passport, which limits your ability to travel around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a gross overstep of government authority, I think.
My hope is that it gets people to call into question the very institution of an entity that can dictate who gets to travel and who doesn't. Again, I think people don't question, most people, unless you're like one of us crazy libertarians, you don't question violations of your rights unless they have a direct impact on your life. And if someone is standing over you, if someone says, okay, you've got to renew your driver's license every year. Okay, that's no big deal. I'll send in the fee, blah, blah, blah. But if it's, okay, you now have to inject all this stuff into your body before you can get a driver's license, that I think is going to cause a lot more people to wake up. And I don't just mean wake up to the vaccine issue, but wake up to the whole idea of, hey, who are these people who think they get to tell us who can drive and who can't, who can travel out of the country and who can't? How did this happen? And who are these people sitting up in Sacramento that get to sit around and vote on how we live our lives and whether we can use plastic straws or not and all this stuff? Because, most people don't question that, but we're getting to the point where it's really starting to affect people on a personal level. And I think you have to start questioning sort of the underlying institution that makes that possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think because this is an area where there's a lot of debate, and even some liberty-minded people still completely, totally buy into the vaccine schedule, which is fine. That's everybody's choice to make.
Should be.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. You should have the ability to make that decision. But one of the arguments, or I guess one of the explanations, I guess, for why people aren't more curious or wanting to know more, childhood vaccinations have been around forever. And we're told how wonderful they are and how we'd all be dead if it weren't for them.
Right.
You learn that in school. Just like, pasteurized milk is so much better for us. It's just kind of part of life. It's normal to have childhood vaccines.
Yeah.
And when the government starts requiring adult vaccinations, then I think you're right. I think a lot of people are going to go, no, wait, what? Adult vaccines? What? Yeah. My parents never had adult vaccines other than the flu shot every year.
Right. And there's so much skepticism about the flu shot, and rightly so, that I think people are already sort of primed to kind of balk at that. But the other thing people don't realize is that, childhood vaccines have been around for a long time, but it was really around the same time that the makers of those vaccines got their immunity from liability that the schedule really started to explode.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is when you look at the explosion in the number of vaccines that people are getting, that kids are getting, and compare it to the number of kids with chronic health conditions, they're both rising at the same, I don't want to say at the same rate, but they're both rising together. So
yeah, I saw and I'll post a link to this in the show notes for today, but I'm actually looking at a picture because I was watching another video, just trying to learn more. And they had a chart that says the number of childhood vaccine injections administered. In 1986, there were 11 on the schedule. Mm-hmm. By 2017, that number was 54. Mm-hmm. And then they also have, on that same thing, they've got this chronic childhood illness and developmental disability prevalence. Yeah. In 1986, it was 12.8%.
Right.
Versus 2011, where it's 54%. So it's almost like a...
yeah, no, I mean,
not that correlation is causation, but
exactly.
It is a little alarming.
Yeah, the correlation is there though.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is alarming, and it's just kind of crazy to me. It's, again, the sort of the PR push or the media push is to sort of normalize these chronic conditions, mm-hmm. and you can't ask the question whether vaccines are related to autism because they crucified Wakefield. And I could do a whole episode on that too. They crucified him for asking that question.
I watched the Vaxxed documentary, and I think what Wakefield was saying is not that we shouldn't give MMR vaccinations, but that maybe we should split them out and make them separate vaccines.
Yeah.
But everybody conflates that with him saying, oh no, we should stop vaccinating. And that's not at all the argument I heard him making.
Right. It wasn't. And the paper never said that the MMR causes autism. It says we've seen this association. And I mean, it was a case study. It was 12 kids. It wasn't
right.
A randomized, basically what it said is we need to do more. We need to look further. We see this association and more study is needed. And when he spoke publicly about it, he said, just to be safe, let's break it up. Let's not give it all together. And interestingly, so he was in the UK at that same time. The UK government stopped allowing the monovalent measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines to be imported into England. So you didn't have a choice anymore. The government basically mandated, just like, I'm sure that's how it is here now. You can't get tetanus by itself. I don't think there's any way to get measles by itself. So the government removed that choice. He was saying, hey, to be safe, let's do these separately. And the government wouldn't allow it.
Wow. And
then that story, it's just funny because that story is then used to say, well, because of what Andrew Wakefield said, parents in America stopped vaccinating or really declined. The MMR uptake really declined. And that's why we're having these outbreaks now. Well, it didn't decline. If you look at the CDC numbers, it's actually, there was a little dip right before his paper came out. And a tiny dip from what was it, 91% to 89% or something. But it's held steady between 91 and 94%. It didn't go down after that. The MMR uptake in this country did not go down. So it's just it's another example of how there's this PR push based oftentimes on flat out lies to push this agenda. And again, if you don't look yourself, if you don't look closely, a lot of people believe that that's what happened, that this paper came out questioning vaccines and the role, vaccines' role in autism. All of a sudden, lots of parents stopped vaccinating, and now we're having these big outbreaks in America. Well, that's not what happened.
What are some good sources for people who are vaccine curious?
Okay.
What are some reliable sources that don't necessarily have a motive or they haven't chosen a side? Or do those places even exist?
I would say the places to look that don't have a side are some of the studies, are the scientists. Because when you look at the actual science, yes, some of it is influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. Some of it is, BS science. Some of it's obviously, pushing an agenda, but some of it's not. And it's a tough question because people are always asking me, where do I go to look? There's not one source. I would start with the people who are questioning vaccines and then look at their sources. So go to children'shealthdefense.org. They've got a lot of research up there. They've got a lot of they've got a lot of their own work. Go to ICAN, Del Bigtree's organization. I think that the link is ICAN Decide, ICAN Decide.org. Again, they have a bunch of research published. They have a bunch of papers, articles on different topics. And look, I can also recommend a couple of journals. Like Jeremy Hammond is doing a great job. He, as a journalist, is covering the issue very, very well. And what I would say is, don't trust anyone's opinion about this. Don't just believe what Del Bigtree says or what RFK says or what Jeremy says or what I say. Don't just believe what we're saying about the issue. Look at the sources we cite and go there. And then, you know what? Compare that. Go to, if you really want to find out, I think you've got to look at what both sides are saying. So go to Skeptical Raptor and find out what he says about, but don't just take his word for it. Look at his sources. Look at what, does what he say make sense? Do the studies he links to actually say what he says they're saying, that kind of thing. I would start there. I would start with children'shealthdefense.org, ICANDecide.org, Jeremy Hammond, and then compare what they're saying to like Skeptical Raptor. There are some great books out. I don't think you're going to find anyone who's writing about vaccines who doesn't have a position. The closest thing that comes close to that would be what your doctor won't tell you about vaccines. It's not anti-vaccine. It's just acknowledging that there are adverse effects from them and looking at if you're going to vaccinate, what's the safest way of doing it.
Well, if folks want to follow you, where is a good place to find you on the www?
So I probably my blog, it's www.Bretigne, weird name. It's www.bretigne.com. Also, if you want to read my children's book, which I just published, Annabelle Pickering and the Sky Pirates, it's all about freedom and freedom of information and of speech and freedom to research. And so it's not about vaccines, but it ties in. I just want to give it a plug because it does tie into the sort of the liberty and the sort of freedom of information, freedom of speech issues. But basically go to my blog is probably the best place. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I try not to spend too much time on them. I'm on ThinkSpot, which is just getting started. That's basically it. But I would say just go to my blog.
Well, I will be sure and put that on today's show notes.
Great.
I mean, the correlation to me between this issue and cannabis is that when we try to bring up the science to our legislators, the legislators say, "Oh, well, there's no science," and then when you try to bring up potential issues with vaccines. I mean, because what I've learned in learning about cannabis is that nobody's body responds the exact same way.
That's the other thing, yeah.
As the next person. And so for somebody to say, oh, no, the science is settled, vaccines don't cause any injury. Well, theirs is a pretty good indication that that's not completely accurate. And then the fact that the vaccine court is paying out money is also an indication that that's not accurate to say that vaccines are safe and effective. Or at least vaccines are safe, so I think parents should be able to ask questions and not be made fun of or called ignorant or stupid or you want your kids to die just because they ask questions. I mean, at this point, I'm questioning everything.
Yeah, well, you have to, especially when there's a multi-billion-dollar industry pushing an agenda. It'd be crazy not to ask questions.
I find it appalling that, we have access to this information because we live in a digitally connected world. So people that live in first world countries have the option to go out and do this research. But when you live in Africa,
oh my God, yeah,
where you don't have electricity, you don't even have running water, and these people show up and they say, hey, this is going to help you and your kids, you can't even research to see if what they're telling you is true.
Right. Well, and
I think they're just taking advantage of people who aren't educated and have no ability to educate themselves on this topic.
Yeah, they really are. In fact, there was just, I'll send you Jeremy's piece on this too. It just came out that the WHO was testing a malaria vaccine on some people in Africa without informed consent, and
Wow.
that there were deaths. Yeah, it's an ugly situation. Something that they couldn't get away with in America, other than by mandating vaccines and then seeing how things play out. But yeah, that's exactly true.
I mean, that's just beyond the pale to go and take advantage of some of the most economically disadvantaged people on the face of the planet, and let's just go experiment on them because nobody's going to find out about it.
Right.
I'll probably delete this out because I'm getting a little off the rails here.
Yeah, but that's true, but it's also true.
Well, Bretigne, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this issue. Like I said, I don't know the science, and I can't go out and pretend that I know the science. But what I will tell people is to ask questions, and there's nothing wrong with asking questions. You're not a freak show, and you're not endangering your child by asking questions about what people are injecting into them.
Exactly.
Well, thanks again for all the information. I hope maybe this has been a discussion that people won't automatically recoil in horror about.
Yeah.
That I'm hoping that by approaching it from this aspect, we can avoid all the emotional, visceral responses that you have when you discuss this issue.
Yeah, and I'm happy to come on and deal with those responses too. If you get a flood of hate mail or something, I'm happy to come back and defend.
I've been surprised because I think a lot of the people, especially people with kids that I've talked to, I think a lot of those people are suspect, or they know that a lot of their children's underlying issues are as a cause of all these vaccines, or feel like they're caused by these vaccines.
I feel like a lot more people are becoming more skeptical. Even if they haven't had a reaction with their own kids. It's like I get the sense that people are starting to wake up to sort of the corrupt nature of the whole setup, and why are they pushing mandates, and just hopeful. I mean, we're still a small minority, but I do feel like there's more questioning going on.
Yeah, I mean, if they're so great, then you shouldn't have to pass laws forcing people to do it. And on top of that, I don't think, from a natural rights perspective, the government doesn't have the authority to tell us what we have to inject into our body, no more than they have the authority to tell us, no, you can't smoke that plant, or no, you can't eat that candy bar because it's got sugar in it.
Right. If they can do that, if they can force you to inject something into your body, it's over. I mean, what can't they do? What can't they do at that point?
Yeah, we have become complacent and put off a lot of our own personal responsibilities on the government. And I think that's the root cause of a lot of our problems, is that we think that it's the government's job to protect us, and it's really not. We need to take more personal responsibility for our own bodies, for our own health, and our own freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Bretigne. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Show notes for today's episode can be found out at cannabishealsme.com/105. I am not sure if I will have an episode out come Monday. As most of you know, I am a certified public accountant by trade. And as you might suspect, since we're only 3 weeks away from the deadline, and as you might suspect, it's a little busy time. Yes, the IRS gave an extension, but for clients that I have who have paid in too much, they don't want to wait till July to get their money from the IRS. So I'm still in the process of trying to push out tax returns. And I don't know that I'm going to have time to get another episode edited and put out by Monday. If not, we will have an episode out Monday after next, and then I'll have a follow-up episode for you on that following Thursday. So if I'm not able to get out an episode this next week, we'll have 2 episodes out the following week. Hopefully, I'll be able to get some stuff done and be able to get an episode out to you on Monday. But if not, I got to kind of do the job that pays the bills around here, and that is CPA, accounting, and tax work. Hit the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode of the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast app you're using. Do you have a suggestion for a guest on Cannabis Heals Me? Send an email to podcast@cannabishealsme.com. We'd love to hear from you. Please do not take any information from Cannabis Heals Me or its guests as medical advice. Contact your licensed physician before taking cannabis or using it for medical treatments.